The Prince and the Peddler, the Statue of Glory. Jarmo Palamaki. The king had a large, lovely garden. One day, while admiring this, she had the idea that it would be even better if she could share this wonder with others. From words to deeds, he had beautiful houses built and equipped them with all the wonderful things that could be needed for life. He then elected his good, honorable citizens and gave them powers of attorney to live in these houses and govern them. Everyone could also use the tools in their houses in the gardens belonging to the houses, both for their own benefit and for the benefit of others. But they were not allowed to be sold because everything was the property of the king. The people living in the houses lived happily. What could not be found in the houses, such as food, they got from their gardens. The area began to be called the Ideal Land because everything was so good and ideal. One day, an itinerant peddler arrived in Ideal Land and found all kinds of trinkets in his carriage. Since he did not have his own house in Ideal Land, he lived in his own wagon. In front of this, he erected a large stone statue. The inhabitants of the Ideal Land could hardly hide their curiosity. They had never seen anything like that. In unison, they asked the peddler, "Why don't you live in the house? And what does that big stone statue mean?" He replied, "I am free, but you are the king's slaves. This large statue is an image of myself, of my independence, of being the master of my own life." The questioners became thoughtful. Some began to think out loud. "Actually, you're right. We are tied to houses that are not our property. We are not free." Others asked, "We'd like to have statues like that too. Could we buy those from you?" "Unfortunately, everyone has to build one himself," he replied. "But I have everything you need, all the tools and raw materials you need. You can buy these from me. Just bring some things from your houses as payment, and you will get everything you need." And so the inhabitants carried from their houses the tools that belonged to the king, from their houses as payment for tools and raw materials for the construction of statues. Others worked hard and created fine statues. Others worked even harder and put together even bigger and more wonderful statues. Those with the largest and most visible statues were glorified, and others were despised and even ridiculed. Soon there was a statue in front of each house. Although this meant that the house lacked many necessary utensils, it only bothered them a little. There was only one thing that mattered to them. How can I build my statue bigger than my neighbor's? And if someone's statue lacked size, he decorated it all the more magnificently. The inhabitants bought everything from the peddler, including diamonds and rubies, which of course were only imitations, but which, when viewed from a distance, adorned the statue with their splendor in a very dignified way. Eventually, the prices of raw materials and decorations for the statues rose so high that the residents were forced to give up important, even life-important tools belonging to the house. Those who were not careful soon lost everything they could find in their houses. And since there was no more room for better decorations, they started looking for something similar to these, and there was even a crying shortage of glass shards and bottle caps. In order to prevent others from seeing the misery in which they had to live, such inhabitants began to build fences to keep their neighbors at bay. No one invited their friends over anymore because no one wanted to reveal the misery and poverty they lived in. But the more they suffered, the more they invested in the construction and decoration of their statue. Those who could no longer do so were publicly despised and ridiculed because their weakness and inability had become apparent. Those with better statues were respected, but also envied and hated. The population gradually divided into two camps, the unsuccessful and the successful. In desperation, the others went to ask for help from a peddler, asking if they could still find something to pay for their needs. To this, the peddler replied that they could still sell themselves in exchange for building needs, and that they could thus even get back some of the goods they had pawned. In their distress, they complied with this suggestion and became slaves to the peddler. During the day, they were allowed to live in their houses, but at night they had to toil as his slaves. And so, little by little, all the inhabitants of Ideal Land secretly became slaves of the peddler. Joy had disappeared from their lives, and envy and pretense had taken their place. But in their pride, they did not want to admit this for fear of being despised. One day, the king sent his sons to check how the inhabitants were doing. The prince soon discovered the true nature of the matter. He tried to talk to the residents, but no one wanted to admit his difficulties or that something was wrong. And when the prince tried to enlighten them by telling them the true nature of things, they became angry and began to behave aggressively because they were so accustomed to their pretense that they preferred to live in self-deception rather than face the unpleasant truth. And so the prince decided to show, by example, what their lives could be like. He also got his own house in the area from his father, and so he lived among the other inhabitants as if he were one of them. He took care of his garden and had enough of everything, not only for himself, but was also able to help those in need around him. Often the prince invited others to eat with him, but it was difficult for them to accept this invitation because to do so they would have confessed that they were in need and their pride would not grant it. However, there were those who were desperate enough that getting help was more important to them than holding on to their honor. They met regularly at the prince's house and enjoyed his helpfulness and love, but they were still prisoners of the peddler, and they had to work hard for him. So they asked the prince if there was any way he would buy them free. The prince replied, "Sure, I can do this, but it's not easy. Since you have sold yourselves voluntarily, I can only buy you free, according to the king's law, by taking your place, if you so wish. Gather now, therefore, all the inhabitants who want to be free from their bondage, and I can buy them by selling myself." And so this little band went from house to house, declaring that all who wanted to be bought free from their bondage should gather at the prince's house. But the hearers, in their pride, did not want to admit that they were prisoners and did not follow this call. Of course, there were others who were willing to follow this invitation, and the prince's house gradually became full. So the prince went to the peddler with a long list of names and demanded permission to become his slave instead of those mentioned by name. Of course, the peddler was angry at the thought of losing so many good slaves, but he comforted himself by imagining how easily he could lead the freedmen back into slavery once he had enslaved the prince. And so the prince became the slave of the peddler, who made him do the dirtiest and heaviest work, for he hoped that the prince's health would not endure this. However, after the third night of toil, the prince appeared in front of the peddler and demanded that he be held accountable for his actions. "What are you talking about?" he replied. "You are my slave, and you have no right to demand it." "I do not come in my own name, but my father," the prince replied. "You have taken possession of his property that was not allowed to be sold, and you have even sold it on. That's why you have to pay it all back right away with interest." The peddler paled in horror. He didn't have that much money. "In the name of my father's king, I will take all your property as my father's property, including myself," the prince continued. "But the other slaves of mine, you can't take them from me," he replied. "They sold themselves to me voluntarily. They belong to me." "You are right," replied the prince. "People who voluntarily sold themselves to you and did not want to accept my offer of deliverance. You can take with you, but you must leave here immediately, and you will be banished to the uttermost part of my father's kingdom, so that you will no longer be able to deceive others." And so it happened. The peddler was forever banished to the farthest corner of the kingdom, along with the inhabitants who had not accepted the offer of liberation. The prince destroyed all the statues and fences built in front of the houses, with the help of which the inhabitants had lived in self-deception and hypocrisy. And together with the freed former slaves, he built the dilapidated gardens even more wonderful, and they lived happily and contentedly from this time on.